My name is Lila Brooks, and I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I wasn't born evil. Evil is something that gets carved into you, piece by piece, until you look in the mirror one day and realize you've become exactly what they always said you were. But here's the thing about mirrors. They only show you what's on the surface. They can't reflect the scars underneath, the ones that taught you to stop flinching and start fighting back. Before I became what some might call a monster, I was just a girl who believed in fairy tales. My mother, Elena Brooks, was the kind of woman who could make magic out of nothing. She'd take scraps of fabric from garage sales and turn them into evening gowns that looked like they belonged in magazine spreads. Our living room was her studio, always scattered with sketches, pins, and rolls of silk that caught the afternoon light streaming through our bay windows. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Fashion isn't about the clothes, sweetheart, she'd tell me as I sat cross-legged on the carpet watching her work. It's about telling a story. Every stitch is a word, every seam is a sentence. What story do you want to tell the world? I wanted to tell beautiful stories. I dreamed of following in her footsteps, of creating dresses that would make women feel powerful and radiant. My sketchbook was filled with designs, flowing evening gowns, sharp-shouldered blazers, delicate summer dresses that danced with movement. Mom would look over my shoulder and smile, her fingers gentle as she pointed out details I could improve. You have the eye for it. The gift runs in our family. My grandmother was a seamstress, too. She used to say that clothes are just another language, and we're translators. Those were the golden days, when it was just the three of us, Mom, Dad, and me. Dad would come home from his job at the insurance office with takeout on Friday nights, and we'd eat on the living room floor while Mom worked, laughing at terrible movies and making plans for weekend adventures. He was different then, lighter somehow. He'd spin Mom around the kitchen while she laughed, and he'd listen patiently to my rambling stories about school and friends and the latest dress design I'd sketched. Everything changed the night Mom got sick. It started with headaches that wouldn't go away. Then came the dizziness, the strange lapses in memory, the way her hands would shake when she tried to thread a needle. The doctor's visits blurred together. Specialists, tests, worried conversations and hushed tones. Brain tumor, they finally said. Aggressive. 6 months? Maybe less. She fought it with the same grace she brought to everything else. Even when the chemotherapy stole her hair and left her weak, she'd still pull out her sketchbook during her good moments. "Keep designing to me," she'd whisper when I sat by her hospital bed. "Don't let anyone tell you your dreams are too big." She died on a Tuesday in October, with autumn leaves spiraling past her hospital window. I was 17, a senior in high school, with college applications half filled, and a future I couldn't imagine without her in it. Dad held my hand at the funeral, but I could feel him already slipping away, retreating into some internal space where grief couldn't follow. The house felt hollow without her laughter echoing through the rooms. Dad worked longer hours, came home later, spoke less. I tried to keep her memory alive by working on designs in her old studio, but the magic felt broken without her there to guide me. The sewing machine sat silent, covered in dust, like a monument to something beautiful that had been lost. That's when Maggie appeared. Margaret Stanton was nothing like my mother. Where Mom had been warm and creative, Maggie was polished and calculating. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, manicured nails, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She worked in real estate and had met Dad when he was looking to downsize our house. "Too many memories," she explained quietly.
Instead of selling, he invited her into our lives. "Your father needs companionship," Maggie told me one evening when I found her in our kitchen rearranging Mom's coffee mugs. "And you need a mother figure. We can help each other." She brought her own children with her when she moved in 6 months later. Chloe was 22, a social media influencer with thousands of followers and a wardrobe that cost more than my college fund. Ethan was 19, a college dropout who treated our house like his personal hotel. They moved through our spaces with casual entitlement, claiming the best bedrooms, reorganizing furniture, erasing the subtle touches that had made our house a home. "It's so important that we blend naturally as a family," Maggie would say, her voice honey-sweet whenever Dad was within earshot. But when he left for work, her tone would shift, becoming cooler, more businesslike. "Lila, dear, since you're the youngest, it would be so helpful if you could take care of some of the household duties. Chloe and Ethan are at such crucial points in their careers." I didn't know then that I wasn't gaining a family. I was losing the last of mine. But I would learn soon enough that sometimes the people who smile the brightest cast the darkest shadows, and that fairy tales have a way of becoming nightmares when you're no longer the princess of the story. The real cruelty hadn't even begun yet. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Maggie was too smart for that. She understood that sudden changes would alarm my father, so she implemented her vision slowly, like poison dripped into water, drop by drop, until the whole glass becomes toxic. It started with small requests. "Lila, sweetheart, since you're home from school earlier than Chloe gets back from her brand meetings, would you mind starting dinner? I'm just so exhausted from showing houses all day." Her voice would carry that particular tone of martyrdom that made refusing seem cruel. Then it became expectations. "I assume you've already started the laundry. Chloe has that important photo shoot tomorrow, and Ethan's going out with potential investors tonight." The phrasing was careful, not a direct order, but an assumption that my compliance was already a given. Within 3 months, I had become the household manager by default. I grocery shopped, cooked meals, cleaned bathrooms, and did everyone's laundry. Meanwhile, Chloe spent her days crafting Instagram posts about her authentic lifestyle brand, and Ethan slept until noon before playing video games or disappearing with friends who treated our house like their personal hangout spot. "This is so good for building character," Maggie would tell my father over dinner, as I served the meal I'd spent 2 hours preparing. "Lila's learning real-life skills. So many young people today don't understand the value of hard work." Dad would nod absently, cutting his chicken without looking up. That's good, Maggie. Elena would have wanted her to be responsible." The casual invocation of my mother's name was like a slap. Elena would have wanted me to follow my dreams, to fill out those college applications gathering dust on my desk, and to spend my senior year focused on my future, instead of scrubbing their bathroom tiles. But Dad seemed to have forgotten that version of my mother, the one who encouraged my ambitions instead of crushing them under the weight of domestic servitude. The worst part wasn't the work itself. It was the way they made me invisible while I did it. Chloe would live stream her morning routine while I cleaned the kitchen behind her, positioning myself carefully out of frame so I wouldn't ruin her aesthetic. She'd talk to her followers about her amazing family and blessed life, while I scrubbed the dishes she dirtied making her elaborate smoothie bowls. "God, could you be any louder with those dishes?" she'd snap during one of her videos, not bothering to turn around. "Some of us are trying to work here."
Ethan was worse in some ways because his cruelty was more active. He'd invite friends over without warning, leaving me to scramble and prepare snacks and clean up their messes. They'd sprawl across the living room furniture with their dirty shoes, playing music too loud and treating me like hired help. "Hey, Cinderella," one of his friends called out once, making the others laugh. "Think you could grab us some more beers and maybe wipe down the coffee table while you're at it?" Ethan thought this was hilarious. "That's what she's here for, right? Mom says she needs to learn responsibility." He'd say it with this satisfied smirk, like he'd discovered some profound truth about the natural order of things. The clothes were another humiliation entirely. While Chloe received packages from fashion brands daily, free merchandise in exchange for her social media posts, I made do with thrift store finds and the clothes I'd had before Maggie moved in. My jeans developed holes that I had to patch carefully, and my shoes wore thin from all the household errands. You know, Lila, Chloe said one morning, examining her nails as I packed her a lunch she'd never eat. If you took better care of yourself, maybe you'd have better opportunities. Image is everything in today's world. She was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, her hair professionally styled, her makeup flawless. Meanwhile, I stood there in yesterday's clothes because I'd been too tired the night before to do my own laundry after finishing everyone else's. The final insult came when college acceptance letters started arriving. I'd managed to submit a few applications despite everything, staying up late to write essays and fill out forms. When the thick envelope from the Fashion Institute arrived, my heart soared. I'd been accepted, with a partial scholarship based on my portfolio. I showed the letter to Dad that evening, my hands shaking with excitement. For a moment, his face lit up with something that looked like the father I remembered. "Eleanor would be so proud," he said quietly, and I thought maybe, finally, things would change. But Maggie was reading over his shoulder. "Oh, how wonderful," she exclaimed, but her eyes were calculating. Though I do wonder about the timing. Senior year is so stressful, and with all the responsibilities Lila has here. Plus, fashion school is so expensive, even with a partial scholarship. There would be living expenses, supplies, all those extra costs. I watched my father's face close off again. Maybe it would be better to wait a year, get some real-world experience first. "I could get real-world experience at fashion school," I said, but my voice came out smaller than I intended. "Of course, dear," Maggie said smoothly, "but there's something to be said for understanding how a household runs before you try to run a business. These skills you're learning now, they're invaluable." The acceptance letter went into a drawer, and I watched my future slip away like water through my fingers. That night, I heard Chloe on the phone with one of her friends. "It's actually perfect," she was saying. "Lila's like our live-in housekeeper now. Mom doesn't even have to pay for cleaning services anymore. And the best part? She actually thinks she's being helpful." Their laughter followed me down the hallway as I carried a basket of their clean clothes to fold and put away. But even caged birds still have claws. I just hadn't discovered mine yet. Salvation came in the form of Mrs. Harper, our next-door neighbor who had been watching our household's transformation with increasingly sharp eyes. Dorothy Harper was 73 years old. With silver hair she wore in a neat bob and a gaze that could see through bullshit like X-ray vision. She had been my mother's friend, one of the few people who still remembered Elena Brooks as more than just Daniel's first wife.
I was taking out the trash one evening, another task that had somehow become mine, when Mrs. Harper called over from her garden where she was deadheading roses in the fading light. "Lila, dear, could you help me with something? These old hands aren't what they used to be." I glanced back at the house nervously. Maggie didn't like me chatting with neighbors when there was work to be done, but she was out showing a property and wouldn't be back for an hour. Mrs. Harper's kitchen smelled like lavender and old books. She moved slowly, deliberately, as she put on the kettle for tea. "Your mother used to bring you over here when you were little," she said, not looking at me directly. "You'd sit at that very table and draw while Elena and I talked. Such beautiful pictures you made. Princesses and ball gowns and magical creatures." My throat tightened. I'd forgotten about those visits, how Mom would let me bring my crayons and sketchpad while she and Mrs. Harper caught up over coffee. "I remember," I said quietly. "Do you still draw?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. "I don't really have time anymore." Mrs. Harper turned to face me then, her blue eyes sharp and knowing. Your mother always said you had the gift. Shame to waste it." She poured the tea, her movements precise despite her earlier claims about old hands. "You know, I still have some of Elena's old sewing magazines upstairs. Fashion sketches, pattern ideas. Been meaning to go through them, but..." She shrugged.
Perhaps you'd like to help me sort them sometime." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The next week, I found myself in Mrs. Harper's attic, surrounded by boxes of my mother's memories. Maggie thought I was helping an elderly neighbor with housework. Technically true, though she would have been furious if she knew what kind of work it really was. The magazines were treasure troves of inspiration. Vogue from the 80s, Harper's Bazaar from the 90s, and smaller publications focused on up-and-coming designers. But more precious than any magazine or the sketches my mother had left behind. Loose papers tucked between pages, margin notes on design modifications, fabric swatches taped to pages with her neat handwriting noting, "Perfect for evening wear," or "Too heavy for summer." "She never lost the passion," Mrs. Harper said, watching me trace my finger over my mother's sketches. "Even when she got sick, she kept designing, said it was her way of imagining beautiful futures." That night, I snuck into our attic and found my mother's old sewing machine, buried under dusty Christmas decorations and forgotten boxes. It was a Singer, vintage, but well-maintained, with mother-of-pearl buttons and elegant curves. I carried it carefully to my room and set it up in my closet where the sound would be muffled. I started small, sketching during the rare moments when the house was quiet, usually late at night after everyone else was asleep. My hands remembered the rhythm my mother had taught me, the way to hold a pencil to capture the flow of fabric, the techniques for shading and proportion. The drawings weren't as good as they'd been in high school, but they were mine, secret and precious. Mrs. Harper became my lifeline. Every few days, I'd slip over to her house with the excuse of checking on her, and she'd show me new magazines or books about fashion history. She never directly criticized my situation at home, but she had a way of making pointed observations. "Your mother always said fashion was about empowerment," she mentioned one afternoon as we looked through a book about Coco Chanel, "about giving women armor disguised as beauty. She believed clothes could change how a woman saw herself." "I wish I could have learned more from her," I said. Mrs. Harper looked at me over her reading glasses. "Oh, child, she taught you more than you know. The question is whether you'll choose to remember it." I started staying later at Mrs. Harper's house, working on sketches while she read or knitted. She'd occasionally glance over at my work and nod approvingly, or suggest a modification that would improve the design. Her encouragement was like water to a plant that had been slowly dying.
One evening, I was so absorbed in sketching an evening gown design that I lost track of time. I rushed home to find Maggie waiting in the kitchen, her arms crossed and her expression cold. "Where exactly have you been? Dinner should have been started an hour ago and Ethan's friends are coming over." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I was helping Mrs. Harper. With what, exactly? How long does it take to check on an old woman? Her eyes narrowed. "You've been spending an awful lot of time over there lately." I crutched my sketchbook tighter, grateful I'd had the sense to hide it under my jacket. "She's lonely. Mom always said we should look out for our neighbors." Maggie's expression softened slightly at the mention of my mother, but suspicion remained in her eyes. "Well, your responsibilities are here first. Family comes before neighbors, Lila. I hope you understand that." I nodded and hurried to start dinner, but my heart was racing. That night, I moved the sewing machine deeper into my closet and started being more careful about my visits to Mrs. Harper. But the seed had been planted. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, not just the household drudge, but Lila Brooks, daughter of Elena Brooks, someone with talent and dreams and a future worth fighting for. Mrs. Harper was right. My mother had taught me more than I'd realized, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to remember who I was supposed to be. "They'll keep taking until you make them stop," Mrs. Harper had said during one of our afternoon sessions, her voice casual, but her meaning crystal clear. I was beginning to wonder what it would mean to make them stop. The discovery happened on a Saturday in March, during what Maggie called a family gathering, really just an excuse to show off to her real estate colleagues and their spouses.
I'd spent the morning preparing elaborate appetizers and making sure the house sparkled, while Chloe posed for Instagram photos in 3 different outfits to document her effortless hostess style. I thought my sketchbook was safe. I'd hidden it in my dresser drawer, buried beneath old sweaters that no one else would ever touch. But Chloe had borrowed my hairdryer without asking. Hers had mysteriously stopped working just before her photo session, and apparently decided my room was fair game for exploration. The guests were already arriving when I heard her voice calling from upstairs, sickeningly sweet and theatrical. "Oh my God, everyone, you have to see this!" My blood turned to ice. I was in the kitchen, arranging cheese and crackers on a platter, when I heard the footsteps thundering down the stairs. Chloe appeared in the doorway with my sketchbook in her hands, her eyes bright with malicious glee. "Look what I found," she announced to the assembled crowd of adults who were now gathering in our living room with their wine glasses and curious expressions. "Our little Cinderella thinks she's a fashion designer." She opened the sketchbook and began flipping through pages, holding up my designs like evidence in a trial. The drawings I poured my heart into, evening gowns with flowing trains, sharp blazers with architectural details, and cocktail dresses that captured movement and grace, were displayed for mockery. "This one's my favorite," Chloe said, holding up a sketch of a ball gown I'd designed thinking of my mother. "It's so ambitious. I mean, can you imagine actually trying to make something like this?" The guests laughed politely, the way people do when they're uncomfortable but don't want to seem rude, but their laughter felt like knives. These were professionals, successful people who probably had dreams and ambitions of their own. Yet here they are, participating in the public humiliation of a teenager's aspirations.
"Chloe," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "please give that back." "Oh, but we're just getting started." She flipped to another page, one where I'd written notes about fabric choices and construction techniques. "Look, she even writes little notes like she's a real designer. Silk chiffon for movement, hand-beaded detail at neckline. So professional." Maggie appeared at Chloe's shoulder, and for a moment I hoped she might intervene. Instead, she took the sketchbook and examined it with the same expression she'd used to evaluate a house with foundation problems. "Oh, Lila," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Sweetheart, I think we need to talk about focusing on reality instead of these fantasies." She turned to address the group, transforming into the perfect hostess even as she destroyed my world. "You know how teenagers are, always dreaming about being rock stars or movie stars, or, in this case, fashion designers. We're trying to help Lila understand the value of practical skills instead of chasing impossible dreams." "Mom always said I had talent," I managed to say, my voice cracking. Maggie's smile never wavered, but her eyes flashed with something cold. "Your mother was a loving woman, but perhaps not the most practical. Look where all that artistic dreaming got her, a sewing machine in the attic gathering dust." The cruelty of it took my breath away. She wasn't just dismissing my dreams, she was rewriting my mother's memory, turning Elena's passion into a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition. "These are actually quite good," said one of the guests, a woman I didn't recognize. "Very creative." Chloe laughed. "That's sweet of you to say, but let's be honest, there's a difference between doodling and actually having talent. I mean, anyone can draw a pretty dress. Making it in the real world is completely different." She began tearing out pages, one by one. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the room like gunshots. "Besides, Lila has so many important responsibilities here at home. Don't you, Lila? Maggie was just telling us how much you help with the household management." I watched my designs flutter to the floor. Months of work, pieces of my soul translated into pencil and paper. The ball gown inspired by my mother's memory landed face down on the hardwood, torn down the middle. Dad stood in the corner, holding his drink and staring at the wall. Not at me, not at the destruction of his daughter's dreams, just at some invisible point in space where he could pretend none of this was happening. "Maybe this is for the best," said Maggie, gathering up the torn pages with efficient movements. "No more distractions from real responsibilities. We want Lila to succeed in life, not waste time on unrealistic expectations." The guests murmured agreement and moved back toward their conversations about property values and interest rates. The moment passed, as if it had never happened, just a minor blip in an otherwise pleasant Saturday afternoon. But I remained frozen in the kitchen doorway, watching Maggie deposit the remains of my sketchbook into the trash can like it was nothing more than junk mail. That was the day something inside me cracked. And when things break, they can cut. I helped serve dinner that night with a smile on my face, refill wine glasses, and accepted compliments on the food I'd prepared. But underneath my perfect hostess performance, something fundamental had shifted. They'd taken my mother's memory and twisted it into shame. They'd taken my dreams and turned them into entertainment for strangers. They'd taken too much. As I watched Chloe pose for selfies with Maggie's friends, as I saw my father retreat further into his shell of willful blindness, as I cleaned up the remnants of my destroyed art, I realized something important. I was done being their victim. The question was no longer whether I would fight back. The question was how.
3 weeks after the destruction of my sketchbook, my mother's old Honda finally gave up. The engine made a sound like a dying animal as I tried to start it in the grocery store parking lot, then fell silent forever. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, wondering if this was some kind of cosmic joke. Even my last connection to my mother was being taken away. I called Dad, but it went straight to voicemail. Maggie's phone did the same. Of course, they were both unreachable when I actually needed help. I was about to call a tow truck when a voice called out from behind me. "Car trouble?" I turned to see a guy about my age walking over from the auto shop across the street. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his hands through it, and clothes that were genuinely worn from actual work rather than carefully distressed for Instagram. His hands were clean, but I could see traces of engine grease under his fingernails. "It just died," I said, feeling foolish. "Made this awful noise and then nothing." He smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen directed at me in months. "I'm Kyle. Kyle Ramirez. That's my dad's shop over there." He nodded toward the building behind him. "Mind if I take a look?" I popped the hood, and Kyle leaned over the engine with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what he was looking at. He touched various components, tested connections, and made small humming sounds that somehow conveyed both expertise and sympathy for my dying car. "When's the last time you had the timing belt checked?" he asked. Honestly, I have no idea. My mom used to handle all that stuff, and since she died, I trailed off, not wanting to burden a stranger with my family drama. Kyle's expression softened. "I'm sorry about your mom. Losing a parent is rough." He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag he'd pulled from his pocket. "The good news is, it's fixable. The bad news is, it's going to take a few days to get the parts, but I can give you a good price on the repair." I almost laughed, but it would have come out bitter. "I'm not sure I can afford any price right now." Kyle studied my face for a moment, then glanced back at the Honda. "Tell you what, this is a 2008 Civic, right? My dad's been looking for one just like this to fix up as a project car. What if we work out a payment plan? You can pay us back when you can." The kindness in his offer was so unexpected that I felt tears prick at my eyes. I couldn't remember the last time someone had tried to help me without expecting something in return. "I couldn't be serious," I said. "My mom would haunt me if I left someone stranded," Kyle said with a grin. "Besides, this car's got good bones. It deserves to keep running." While Kyle arranged for the Honda to be towed to his shop,
I found myself actually talking to someone for the first time in months. Really talking. Not just responding to orders or deflecting Chloe's barbs. Kyle asked about school, about what I wanted to do after graduation, and when I mentioned fashion design, he didn't laugh or suggest I be more realistic. "That's cool," he said instead. "My sister's always sketching clothes too. She wants to go to design school in New York." "Your sister sounds smart," I said, thinking of my own abandoned dreams. "She is. Stubborn as hell too. Our parents keep telling her to have a backup plan, but she says backup plans are just excuses to quit." Kyle looked at me directly. "What about you? Any design schools on your list?" I'd saved a few pages from my destroyed sketchbook, the ones that had fallen under the couch during Chloe's destruction spree. On impulse, I pulled them from my purse and showed Kyle one of my evening gown designs. His reaction was immediate and genuine. "Whoa, you drew this?" He held the paper carefully, studying the details. "This is incredible. The way the fabric flows here and these little details around the neckline, you could definitely make it in fashion." It was the first time anyone had looked at my work with respect instead of mockery. The validation hit me like a physical force, and I had to blink back tears.
My stepfamily thinks it's a waste of time, I said quietly. Kyle's expression darkened. Stepfamily, huh? Let me guess, they're not exactly supportive. I gave him a brief, sanitized version of my home situation. Kyle listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as I described Maggie's practical life skills philosophy and Chloe's constant belittling. "That's bullshit," he said bluntly when I finished. "Sorry, but it is. You've got real talent and they're trying to make you ashamed of it." We talked for another hour while waiting for the tow truck. Kyle told me about growing up in his father's shop, about learning to see the potential in broken-down engines and rusted frames. "Everything can be fixed," he said. "It's just a matter of figuring out what's really broken and what's just surface damage." When the tow truck finally arrived, Kyle handed me his business card. "Come by the shop tomorrow if you want. I should have a better idea of the timeline by then. And," he hesitated, then smiled, "bring more of your designs if you want. I'd love to see them." That night, I lay in bed thinking about Kyle's words. For the first time in months, someone had seen value in me, not as a housekeeper or a cautionary tale, but as a person with talent and potential. The feeling was intoxicating. But even as I savored the memory of genuine kindness, I could feel something harder crystallizing in my chest. Kyle represented the life I could have if I played the long-suffering Cinderella who eventually finds her prince and escapes to a better life. The problem was I was beginning to realize I didn't want to be rescued. I wanted to be the one doing the rescuing, starting with myself. Kyle showed me the life I could have, but the life I was starting to choose was darker, more complicated, and infinitely more powerful than anything a fairy tale could offer. The financial discovery happened by accident. I was organizing Dad's desk, another task that had somehow become mine, when I found the credit card statements scattered beneath a pile of real estate documents. At first, I was just trying to sort the papers into neat stacks. But then the numbers started jumping out at me. $50,000 to Chloe Stanton brand development, $12,000 for Ethan's educational expenses, which was laughable since he dropped out of college months ago. $8,000 to something called lifestyle enhancement consulting, which I eventually realized was just Maggie paying herself for services that didn't exist. My college fund, the money Mom and Dad had carefully saved for my education, had been systematically drained to fund my stepfamily's lifestyle. The Fashion Institute acceptance letter that had been dismissed as impractical
could have been easily affordable if they hadn't been treating my inheritance like their personal ATM. I photographed every statement with my phone, my hands shaking with rage. They'd stolen my future and made me feel guilty for even dreaming of having one. But the money was just the beginning of that week's revelations. 2 days later, I was cleaning Ethan's room, a disaster zone of empty beer bottles, pizza boxes, and clothes that reeked of marijuana, when I heard a crash from downstairs. I rushed down to find Ethan standing over the remains of my mother's antique jewelry box, the one she'd inherited from her grandmother. The delicate wooden inlays were splintered, and costume jewelry was scattered across the hardwood floor like fallen stars. "Oops," Ethan said, not sounding sorry at all. He was clearly drunk, swaying slightly as he surveyed the damage. "That was my mother's," I whispered, kneeling to gather the broken pieces. "Yeah, well, maybe you shouldn't leave valuable stuff lying around where people can knock it over." He stepped over me and headed toward the kitchen. "Besides, it's not like she's using it anymore." The cruelty was so casual, so thoughtless that it took my breath away. This wasn't just an accident, it was deliberate destruction of something irreplaceable, and he clearly enjoyed my pain. But the worst betrayal was yet to come.
That weekend, while I was at Kyle's shop beaking up my repaired Honda, I overheard Maggie and Chloe talking in the living room. I'd forgotten my purse and had slipped back through the side door to retrieve it when their voices stopped me in the hallway. "The girl's becoming a problem," Maggie was saying. "She's been acting differently lately, more defiant." "I noticed that too," Chloe replied. "She barely flinched when I destroyed those stupid drawings. The old Lila would have cried for days." "Well, we can't have her getting ideas above her station. Daniel's already too soft with her as it is." Maggie's voice carried that calculating tone I'd learned to fear. "Did you know she was Elena's little princess, always encouraging those ridiculous artistic dreams, filling her head with nonsense about following her passion?" "God, Elena was such a mess," Chloe said with a laugh. "Remember what Dad told us about how she died? All that creative energy, and where did it get her? Dead at 42, with nothing to show for it but a pile of fabric scraps and a daughter who thinks she's the next Coco Chanel." My blood turned to ice. The way Chloe said Dad told us made it clear she was talking about my father. Daniel had shared intimate details about my mother's death, had turned her memory into gossip for his new family to mock. "Elena was weak," Maggie continued, "always dreaming instead of dealing with reality. I'm doing Lila a favor by teaching her how the real world works. Someone has to prepare her for disappointment. Plus, let's be honest, having a live-in housekeeper who works for free is pretty convenient. Why would we want to change that arrangement?" They laughed together, the sound sharp and ugly in the afternoon silence. I stood frozen in the hallway, clutching my purse to my chest. They weren't just using me, they were actively poisoning my father against my mother's memory. They'd taken his grief and loneliness and twisted it into weapons against me. The betrayal of my father's complicity cut deeper than anything else. He'd shared private moments with them, had let them rewrite the story of his first marriage, had allowed my mother into a cautionary tale about the dangers of dreaming too big. I slipped out through the side door and sat in my car for 20 minutes, processing what I'd heard. The Honda's engine hummed quietly. Kyle had done beautiful work restoring it, but even that small victory felt hollow now. That night, I made a decision. If they wanted to see me as calculating and cold, then that's exactly what I'd become. If they thought my mother was weak for chasing dreams, then I'd show them what strength really looked like. I'd been playing defense for too long, letting them set the rules of engagement. But games have a way of changing when one player decides to stop following the established patterns. Mrs. Harper had been right. They would keep taking until I made them stop. I'd been too focused on survival to realize that sometimes survival itself requires becoming something your enemies never saw coming. If they saw me as nothing,
then I would become something they'd fear. The mistreated stepdaughter was about to disappear forever. In her place, something far more dangerous was being born. The transformation didn't begin with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It started with observation, with learning to see my stepfamily the way they'd been seeing me all along, as pieces in a game to be strategically maneuvered. Mrs. Harper became my unlikely teacher in the art of warfare. When I showed up at her door the day after overhearing Maggie and Chloe's conversation, she took one look at my face and knew something fundamental had shifted. "They pushed too far, didn't they?" she said simply, pouring tea with steady hands. I told her everything: the stolen money, the destroyed heirloom, the mocking of my mother's memory. Mrs. Harper listened without interrupting, her expression growing sharper with each revelation.
Your mother was many things, but weak wasn't one of them, she said when I finished. Elena left Daniel everything he needed to take care of you properly. If he's chosen to let that woman pillage your inheritance, that's a choice he's making. What can I do about it? The question came out smaller than I intended. Mrs. Harper's smile was razor thin. Oh, my dear, you can do quite a lot, actually. But first, you need to learn how the world really works. Money, power, influence, these are tools, and tools can be used by anyone smart enough to pick them up. Over the next 2 weeks, Mrs. Harper taught me things they don't cover in high school civics classes. How to read financial documents, how to trace money trails, how to document evidence of financial mismanagement. She'd been a high school literature teacher, but her late husband had been a lawyer, and she'd absorbed more about legal strategy than most people learned in law school. Knowledge is power, she said, showing me how to research public records online, but applied knowledge is control. I learned that Maggie's real estate license was up for renewal, and that several of her recent deals had involved questionable ethical practices. I discovered that Chloe's brand was hemorrhaging money despite the constant social media presence, and that most of her followers were purchased bots. I found out that Ethan had been arrested twice for drunk driving, but had somehow avoided having his license suspended, thanks to expensive lawyers paid for with my college fund. But more importantly, I learned how to move through the world differently. Mrs. Harper let me some of her late daughter's clothes, elegant pieces from the 80s and 90s that had been stored carefully in cedar chests. They fit me perfectly, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I barely recognized. Not the exhausted household drudge, but a young woman with sharp eyes and perfect posture. Presentation is half of power, Mrs. Harper told me. Let them see that you're not the same frightened girl they've been abusing. The first test came at Chloe's latest brand event, a product launch for her signature line of aromatherapy candles at a trendy downtown cafe. She'd been planning it for weeks, desperate to impress a group of local influencers and potential investors. I arrived 30 minutes after the event started, wearing a black vintage blazer and carrying myself with the quiet confidence Mrs. Harper had been teaching me. Chloe barely glanced at me when I walked in. She was too busy performing for her audience, talking animatedly about authentic luxury experiences and mindful living. But I hadn't come to watch. I had come to work. I spent 20 minutes circulating through the crowd, introducing myself as Lila Brooks, fashion consultant. I'd researched every person on the guest list, knew their businesses, their interests, their social media followings. I asked intelligent questions about their work, complimented their choices, and subtly redirected conversations away from Chloe's candles toward more interesting topics. By the time Chloe tried to gather everyone for her presentation, half the room was engaged in animated conversations with me about fashion trends, business strategy, and creative projects. Her audience was distracted, unfocused, and when she finally got their attention, the energy had completely shifted. The coup de grace came when one of the investors asked me about my own work. I showed him some of my redesigned sketches. I'd been creating new pieces based on Mrs. Harper's magazines, and he was genuinely impressed. Have you considered applying for the mentorship program at the Design Institute? I sit on their advisory board. This kind of work would definitely be competitive.
Chloe's face went white. Her own event had just become a networking opportunity for her stepsister's fashion career, the career she'd tried to destroy.
That night, Chloe confronted me in the kitchen, her usual smugness replaced by genuine anger. "What the hell was that?" she demanded. "That was my event, my networking opportunity." I looked up from the dishes I was washing, still playing the role for now, and smiled. I was just being social. Isn't that what you always say, that networking is everything? You embarrassed me in front of important people. Did I? I thought I was just having conversations about fashion. I'm sorry if that was somehow inappropriate. The innocent tone was perfectly calibrated to infuriate her, and it worked. Chloe stormed out, leaving me alone with the satisfaction of my first small victory. Over the next week, I systematically dismantled Ethan's social standing with his friend group. It was surprisingly easy. All it took was showing up to a few parties looking polished and confident, then letting his friends see the contrast between his lazy entitlement and my focused ambition. Boys who had once ignored me while treating our house like a frat house suddenly found me interesting, and by extension, found Ethan less so. "Your sister's pretty cool," one of them told Ethan after I'd spent an evening discussing photography techniques and travel plans. "Why didn't you ever introduce us properly?" The power was intoxicating. For the first time in months, I felt like I had agency, like my actions could create real consequences in the world. When Maggie tried to assign me extra chores, I complied with perfect grace, but somehow the tasks took twice as long as usual. When Dad asked about household expenses, I provided detailed breakdowns that subtly highlighted exactly where the money was really going. I was still playing the dutiful stepdaughter on the surface, but underneath I was becoming something far more dangerous. For the first time in my life, they feared me. And I discovered that I liked it very much indeed. Power, I discovered, was like a drug with increasingly diminishing returns. Each small victory required a bigger scheme. Each manipulation needed to be more elaborate than the last. What had started as self-defense was becoming something darker, more addictive. The house had become my chessboard, and I was learning to play several moves ahead. My next target was the trust between Chloe and Ethan. Siblings who had spent years united in tormenting me were about to discover that loyalty was a luxury they couldn't afford when survival was at stake. It started with Ethan's credit card, the one linked to Dad's account that he used for his endless nights out. I'd memorized the number from handling Dad's mail, and I'd learned enough about online banking to transfer small amounts between accounts. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create discrepancies that would raise questions. When Chloe's business account mysteriously showed several charges for expensive dinners and club tabs, all perfectly matching Ethan's spending patterns, she noticed immediately. "Ethan," she screamed from the kitchen one morning, laptop open to her banking statements. "What the hell is this?" I was making breakfast, perfectly positioned to watch the drama unfold. Ethan stumbled downstairs, still half asleep and nursing what was clearly a massive hangover. What? He mumbled, squinting at the screen. $300 at Vertigo, $200 at that sushi place downtown, another $400 at Club Nexus. My business card was used for all of this, and guess who is posting Instagram stories from those exact locations? The beauty of the setup was that Ethan couldn't deny being at those places. His social media was a detailed record of his whereabouts. He could only deny using her card, which sounded exactly like something a guilty person would say. "I never touched your card, Chloe. Why would I even need to? I have my own." "Because yours is maxed out again. Mom had to bail you out last month, remember?" The fight escalated until Maggie stormed in, furious at the commotion. When presented with the evidence, she immediately sided with Chloe. Her precious daughter's business empire was too important to risk over Ethan's irresponsible spending habits. I'm changing all the passwords, Maggie declared. And Ethan, you're on an allowance until you prove you can be trusted again. This is bullshit, Ethan shouted. I'm 20 years old, not 12. Then start acting like it, Maggie snapped back. The household dynamic had shifted permanently. Chloe now watched Ethan with suspicious eyes, while Ethan resented being treated like a child. The united front they'd once presented against me was cracking, and I was just getting started. My manipulation of Dad was more subtle, but far more devastating. I'd started leaving documents where he'd find them, printouts of Maggie's real estate transactions that showed potential conflicts of interest, credit card statements highlighting the drain on family finances, college brochures with my old acceptance letters attached. I never directly accused or confronted. Instead, I played the role of the concerned daughter who just wanted to understand where things stood. "Dad, I found this while organizing your desk," I'd say, handing him a statement showing another $5,000 transfer to Chloe's failing business. Should I file it with the other financial stuff? Each document was a seed of doubt, planted carefully and allowed to grow. I watched him start to question things he'd blindly accepted, saw him begin to notice patterns he'd been willfully ignoring. The psychological warfare was working, but it was changing me too. Kyle noticed it during one of our regular coffee dates. Yes, we'd been seeing each other more often, though I kept those meetings carefully separate from my home life. "You seem different lately," he said one afternoon as we sat in his favorite diner. "More, I don't know, calculating? Like you're always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else." I stirred my coffee slowly, considering how much to reveal. Maybe I'm just learning to protect myself. Protect yourself from what exactly? Your family? The word family made me laugh, but it came out bitter and sharp. They're not my family. Family doesn't steal your inheritance to fund their shopping habits. Family doesn't destroy your dreams for entertainment. Kyle reached across the table and touched my hand. "I know they've hurt you, but this anger, it's changing you into someone I barely recognize. The girl I met a few months ago was sad but hopeful. Now you seem cold. Maybe cold is what I need to be to survive." "Survive what? It's not like you're in physical danger. You could leave, get a job, find roommates, start over somewhere else." "And let them win?" The words came out sharper than I intended. Let them steal everything that belonged to my mother and act like they did nothing wrong? Kyle pulled his hand back, studying my face with growing concern. "You're becoming what you hate," he said quietly. "The manipulative, calculating person you're turning into, how is that different from what they've done to you?" I met his eyes directly, no longer bothering to hide the hardness I felt growing inside me. "The difference is that I'm better at it than they are." Kyle sat back in his seat, and I could see the exact moment when he realized that the girl he had fallen for was disappearing. Maybe she was already gone. "I loved the girl you used to be," he said finally. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe that girl was too weak to survive." We finished our coffee in silence, both of us knowing that something fundamental had shifted between us. Kyle represented the path back to softness, to vulnerability, to the kind of love that required trust and openness. But I was discovering that power was a more reliable companion than love. Power couldn't be taken away by death or betrayal. Power didn't depend on other people's mercy or kindness. Power was mine to keep, and I was learning to wield it like a blade. The question was no longer whether I was becoming a monster. The question was whether I cared. The final confrontation came on a Tuesday evening in late April, when the cherry blossoms outside our windows were in full bloom, a mockery of beauty in what was about to become a battlefield. Maggie had figured it out. I should have known she was too calculating to miss the patterns forever.
The mysterious financial discrepancies, the way her children had turned against each other, the subtle changes in Dad's behavior. She'd finally connected the dots back to me. "We need to talk," she said, appearing in the kitchen doorway as I finished loading the dishwasher. Her voice was different. No longer the honey-sweet manipulation or cold authority I'd grown accustomed to. This was the voice of someone who'd finally recognized a worthy opponent. She gestured toward the living room, and I followed with the calm confidence Mrs. Harper had taught me. No rushing, no defensive postures. Queens didn't scurry. "You've been busy," she said, settling into the armchair that had once been my mother's favorite spot. The symbolism wasn't lost on either of us. "I don't know what you mean," I replied, taking a seat across from her with perfect composure. Maggie laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, you're good. I'll give you that. Better than I thought possible. The financial transfers, turning my children against each other, those little seeds of doubt you've been planting with Daniel. Very sophisticated for someone your age." I said nothing, letting her reveal how much she actually knew. "The question is," she continued, leaning forward, "what exactly do you think you're accomplishing? You're 18 years old, with no money, no connections, and no real power. Did you honestly think you could outmaneuver me?" That's when I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd labeled Insurance. Screenshot after screenshot of financial documents, recorded conversations, documentation of every illegal and unethical thing she'd done since moving into our house. "I think you're underestimating what I've learned," I said quietly, scrolling through the evidence. "For instance, did you know that using your stepchild's college fund to finance your daughter's business could be considered embezzlement? Or that falsifying documents on real estate transactions is a felony?" Maggie's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "You little bitch, those are private family matters." "Are they?" Because Mrs. Harper's husband was a lawyer before he died, and she helped me understand exactly what kind of criminal exposure you have here. I looked up from my phone, meeting her eyes directly. Turns out, private family matters become public legal issues when they involve fraud. "You have no idea what you're playing with," Maggie said, her voice tight with rage. "I could destroy you, make your life so miserable that—" "That what?" I interrupted. "You'll force me to do all the household work while your children live in luxury? Make me feel worthless and alone? Mock my dead mother's memory? Congratulations, Maggie, you already played that hand." I stood up, and for the first time since she'd moved into our house, Maggie actually flinched. "Here's how this is going to work," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "You're going to transfer the remaining money from my college fund back into an account with my name on it. You're going to stop treating me like household staff, and you're going to convince my father to let me pursue the education my mother wanted for me. And if you don't—" I smiled, and I could feel that it didn't reach my eyes. "Then I send all of this documentation to the state licensing board, the IRS, and the local news station that loves stories about real estate fraud. Your career will be over, Chloe's business will collapse when her funding disappears, and Ethan will have to figure out how to function without Daddy's credit card." Maggie stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating odds, weighing options, realizing that I'd thought several moves ahead of her. "You've become exactly what I always said you were," she said finally. "A manipulative little snake, just like your mother." The insult bounced off me harmlessly. I'd moved beyond caring what she thought of my mother or me. "No," I said calmly. "I've become exactly what you taught me to be." That's when Dad walked in, drawn by the tension in our voices. He looked between us, confusion and concern warring on his face. "What's going on?" he asked. I turned to him, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old Lila, the daughter who had once trusted him to protect her. But that girl was gone, buried under months of betrayal and silence. "Dad," I said, my voice gentle but implacable,
Maggie has something she needs to tell you about where my college money went." I watched his face crumble as the truth finally came out. The stolen funds, the fraudulent transactions, the systematic destruction of everything my mother had worked to provide for me. Maggie tried to justify it, to spin it as family financial management, but the evidence was overwhelming. When it was over, when all the ugly facts were laid bare in our living room, Dad looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Not just love or pride, but fear. He finally understood what his silence had cost and what it had created. "Lila, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you." "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." By the end of that week, Maggie had moved out, taking her children with her. Dad tried to rebuild our relationship, but we both knew too much had been broken. He'd failed me when I needed him most, and I had become someone he barely recognized. I had won. I had reclaimed my inheritance, my future, my power. But why did victory taste like ashes in my mouth? The house was mine again, restored to my mother's memory and my own ambitions, but I was alone in it, transformed by the battle I'd fought to reclaim it. I thought winning would taste sweet. Instead, it tasted like everything I'd lost along the way. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated living room of what was now officially my house, looking out at the same cherry blossoms that had witnessed my final confrontation with Maggie. The space had been transformed back into something that honored my mother's memory, her sewing machine restored to its place of honor, her sketches framed on the walls, her favorite fabrics displayed like works of art. I'd gotten everything I fought for. My college fund was restored and growing with interest. I'd been accepted to the Fashion Institute with a full scholarship, after my portfolio, enhanced by months of secret designing, impressed the admissions committee. Dad had signed the house over to me entirely, a gesture that felt more like penance than generosity. By every measurable standard, I had won. The doorbell rang, interrupting my contemplation. Mrs. Harper stood on my doorstep, holding a bottle of champagne and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "Congratulations! Though you don't look like someone celebrating a victory." I poured us each a glass of champagne, noting how steady my hands were. Months of wielding power had given me an unshakable composure that felt both natural and alien. I suppose I should be happier. I have everything I wanted. Freedom, financial security, a future in fashion design. Maggie's real estate license was suspended, Chloe's business collapsed, and Ethan had to get an actual job. "But," Mrs. Harper prompted. But I look in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. I set down my glass, surprised to find my appetite for celebration was non-existent. Kyle was right. I did become what I hated.
Mrs. Harper studied me with those sharp eyes that had seen through everyone's facades from the beginning. "Your mother faced a similar choice once," she said quietly. "This was news to me. What do you mean? Elena wasn't always the gentle artist you remember. When she was your age, she was fierce, ambitious, willing to fight for what she wanted. She clawed her way out of poverty through sheer determination and, yes, sometimes ruthless choices." Mrs. Harper sipped her champagne thoughtfully. The difference was that she chose to soften as she grew older. She chose love over power, vulnerability over control. "And where did that get her?" I asked, hearing the hardness in my own voice. "Dead at 42 while people like Maggie take whatever they want?" "It got her you," Mrs. Harper said simply. "It got her a daughter she loved completely, a marriage built on genuine affection, and a life filled with beauty she created with her own hands. It got her happiness, Lila, real happiness, not just the satisfaction of defeating enemies." I walked to the window looking out at the garden my mother had planted years ago. The roses were blooming again, tended by the landscaping service I could now afford. I don't know how to be soft anymore, I confessed. Every conversation feels like a chess match. Every relationship feels like a potential threat or asset. I can't turn it off. Can't or won't? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Harper was right, of course. The armor I'd built around myself had become comfortable, even addictive. It was easier to calculate than to feel, easier to manipulate than to trust. My phone buzzed with a text from Kyle. "Thinking of you today. Hope you're doing okay." We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since our last conversation when I'd chosen power over love so definitively that he'd finally stopped trying to reach me. But he still sent these little messages, small gestures of kindness that I never answered but secretly treasured. "He still cares about you," Mrs. Harper observed, reading over my shoulder with the shamelessness of someone who'd earned the right. "He cares about who I used to be," I corrected. "That girl is gone." Is she? Or is she just buried under all that protective ice you've built up? I could have chosen differently in that moment. I could have texted Kyle back, invited him over, tried to remember how to be vulnerable with someone who'd never hurt me. I could have started the long, difficult work of learning to be human again instead of remaining the perfectly controlled queen I'd become. Instead, I deleted his message without responding. They wanted me to be their Cinderella. Instead, I became their queen. I said to Mrs. Harper with a smile that felt like putting on a mask. Mrs. Harper raised her glass in a toast that felt more like a eulogy. "Long may you reign, my dear. But remember, queens who rule alone tend to die alone." That night, I stood in my mother's old studio, surrounded by the tools of creation and beauty she had left behind. I had power now, enough to protect myself from anyone who might try to hurt me again. I had wealth, status, and a future that belonged entirely to me. But as I looked at my reflection in the darkened window, I saw exactly what I'd become. A young woman who'd learned to survive by becoming untouchable, unbreakable, and utterly alone. The evil queen of my own fairy tale, ruling over a kingdom of one. Some might call that a tragedy, but I'd learned that tragedy was just another word for a story where the protagonist refuses to be anyone's victim. And if that made me the villain of someone else's story, well, at least I was the villain who won. After all, happily ever after was never really the point. The point was making sure that no one could ever take from me again. And in that, I had succeeded completely. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.